The barrel of Ranger Barrett's service pistol caught the afternoon sunlight as he aimed it at the gaunt woman kneeling in the dust. Her black hair, crudely self-cut with a knife, hung in tangled strands around a face pale as ash. Gray eyes like a storm stared back at him, but she did not move, could not move. The child in her arms, a golden-haired girl no older than 10, was burning with fever, her breathing shallow and erratic. The twin puncture wounds on her ankle had turned her entire leg into a swollen, discolored nightmare. Every second Barrett wasted pointing that gun was a second closer to the child's death. Raven spoke, her voice hoarse with desperation and exhaustion, telling him the girl had been bitten by a rattlesnake, that she needed a hospital right now. Barrett's lip curled in contempt. He said what he saw was a wanted fugitive holding an unconscious child miles from any trail, then asked if she thought he was stupid, accusing her of kidnapping the girl for ransom or something far worse. Raven cut him off, saying she had saved this child's life. Her arms trembled under the girl's weight, her broken ankle screaming in agony with every heartbeat. But she refused to collapse. Not yet. Not while the child still had a chance. The scars on her body, souvenirs from years of abuse she had barely survived, burned beneath her ragged clothes, as if reminding her what she had endured to reach this moment. The ranger's finger tightened on the trigger. He gave her one final warning, ordering her to put the child down. His other hand reached for his radio, ready to call Derek Lawson and claim his $50,000 bounty. From the distance, a sound began to build. Low at first, then growing into a thunderous roar. Not motorcycles, but something far more ominous. The rumble of engines, dozens of them, powerful and precise. Raven looked past Barrett toward the main highway, where a convoy of black SUVs was converging on their position like a dark tide, sunlight glinting off bulletproof glass and chrome. She did not know who they were or why they were coming. She did not know that the dying child in her arms was Isla Ashford, the only daughter of Lucian Ashford, the most ruthless Mafia boss on the eastern seaboard. She did not know that she had just traded a life of hiding in the shadows for something far more dangerous and far more precious than she could have ever imagined. All she knew was that if Barrett did not lower that gun in the next 10 seconds, the girl she had carried for 4 miles on a broken ankle was going to die. And then the black convoy arrived. If this story gripped your heart, hit that like button and share it with someone who loves a good thriller. Subscribe now so you do not miss what happens next, because in 10 seconds, Raven's entire world was about to change forever. 12 black SUVs came to a stop at the same time, sealing off the area within seconds like a storm of steel. Their doors flew open in unison, and dozens of men in black suits poured out, each of them carrying assault rifles, cold metal glinting under the late afternoon sun. Barrett stood frozen, the pistol in his hand suddenly looking ridiculous and meaningless in the face of this heavily armed force. He took a step back, his survival instinct screaming that he should run, but his legs felt nailed to the ground. From the first vehicle, a man stepped out. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair lightly touched by silver at the temples, and icy blue eyes that swept across the scene with lethal calm. Lucian Ashford didn't need to say a word. His presence alone thickened the air like the moment before a storm breaks. His gaze passed over Barrett, over the frail woman kneeling on the ground, and then stopped on the blonde child cradled in her arms. The stone-cold face of the Mafia boss cracked for a fleeting moment, a rare flash of pain and panic piercing the steel mask he had worn for years. Lucian rushed to Raven, dropping to his knees, his trembling hand brushing the blonde hair of Isla. He asked urgently, his voice rough and strained, what was wrong with his daughter. Raven looked up at the unfamiliar man, and recognized in those icy eyes the absolute terror of a father. She spoke quickly, her voice drained of strength, saying the child had been bitten by a rattlesnake, that the venom had been spreading for hours, and that they needed to get to a hospital immediately, or it would be too late. Lucian turned to the man standing close beside him, a tall and thin figure with a face as cold as a ghost, and issued an order that didn't allow a single second of delay. Ghost, call a medical helicopter right now. Ghost nodded, the phone already pressed to his ear before Lucian finished speaking. Lucian then stood and turned toward Barrett. The softness that had briefly appeared when he looked at his daughter vanished completely, replaced by the gaze of death itself. He stepped closer to the trembling ranger, his voice sharp and cutting, and asked why he had aimed a gun at the woman who was saving his daughter. Barrett stammered, saying she was a wanted criminal, that he was only doing his job, that someone had paid $50,000 for her head. Lucian said nothing. He simply gave a slight nod toward Ghost. The ghost-like man stepped forward and seized the phone from Barrett's hand despite his weak protests. Moments later, Ghost handed the phone to Lucian, the screen displaying a chain of messages between Barrett and a man named Derek Lawson. Messages about tracking Raven, about the bounty, about dealing with her, if she was found. Lucian finished reading and looked up at Barrett with a stare that nearly brought the ranger to his knees. He spoke slowly, each word cold as ice, saying he wouldn't kill Barrett here because his daughter needed him. But if Isla didn't survive, Barrett would wish he had never been born, and Lucian Ashford always kept his promises. The sound of helicopter blades began to rise in the distance, growing closer with every second. Lucian turned back to Raven and Isla, gently but firmly lifting the child from her arms. For the first time in hours, Raven felt the weight leave her arms, and with it the final thread holding her to consciousness. The helicopter landed, its rotors whipping dust into the air. The medical team rushed out with a stretcher. Isla was placed on it, an oxygen mask fitted over her face, an IV needle piercing her tiny arm. Lucian climbed into the helicopter with his daughter, but before the doors closed, he turned to Ghost and gave an order that didn't accept any argument, telling him to take this woman to the hospital, make sure she received the best care, and ensure no one touched her until he arrived. Ghost nodded. The helicopter lifted off, carrying with it the fragile hope of a father. On the ground, Raven lay in the dust, her broken ankle throbbing, her body completely spent after hours of surviving hell. She tried to open her eyes when Ghost came to her side, wanting to say she didn't need help, that she could take care of herself as she had for the past 2 years. But her lips only moved without sound. Darkness closed in, and Raven let herself sink into it, for the first time in 2 years not fighting to survive through another night. She didn't know that when she opened her eyes again, her life would never be the same. In her drifting haze, memory pulled Raven back to Blackwood Forest, the place she had called home for the past 2 years, where she learned that the key to survival was not strength or bravery but invisibility. At the age of 27, after 2 years of running from a devil in human form, Raven had perfected the art of becoming a ghost. She moved through dense pine canopies like smoke, leaving no trace on the carpet of rotting leaves. Every step was calculated, placed softly and lifted with care, avoiding dry branches that could snap and betray her presence. She learned to read the forest the way one reads a book, knowing when birds fell silent that someone was approaching, knowing when the wind shifted that she had to change position so her scent would not be detected. Her shelter was a hollow dug into the earth, perfectly concealed beneath the roots of a massive fallen oak. She spent weeks digging down, lining the base with dry pine needles, covering it with a camouflage tarp she had found in the trash behind a hunting store 3 towns away. From the outside, it looked like nothing more than a pile of dead branches and decaying leaves. No one would ever guess a human being lived beneath it. She could dismantle her entire shelter within 30 seconds if she heard unfamiliar footsteps, erasing every trace of her existence and melting into the deep forest as if no one had ever been there. Food was a daily battle. Raven set traps along rabbit trails, simple snare traps made from paracord she always kept with her. She learned which wild berries were safe to eat and which would kill her within hours. She knew which streams held clean water she could drink directly, and which ones had to be boiled before touching her lips. On lucky days, when a rabbit or squirrel was caught, she had protein to keep her strength. On unlucky days, she lived on berries and roots, her stomach twisting with hunger. But she didn't allow herself to complain. Hunger was still better than returning to the hell she had escaped. Fire was an art she paid for with many freezing nights before mastering it. She used the Dakota fire hole technique, digging 2 holes connected by an underground tunnel, one for the fire and one for airflow. The flame burned hidden beneath the ground, hot and clean, producing almost no smoke that could be seen from afar. She only made fire when it was absolutely necessary, to cook food or on winter nights so cold they could kill her, and she always extinguished it before dawn when light could make even the faintest smoke visible. Once a week, she bathed in icy mountain streams, water so cold it cut into her skin like thousands of needles. She had no soap, using only fine sand from the stream bed to scrub away dirt and sweat. Afterward, she crushed fresh pine needles and rubbed them over her body, letting the scent of resin mask her human smell, allowing her to blend into the forest as part of it. Her clothes were torn camouflage pieces scavenged from donation bins and trash containers, patched together with clumsy stitches using thread pulled from scraps of fabric. She looked no different from a wild animal, dark hair tangled and self-cut with a knife she kept sharp like a treasure, skin pale from lack of direct sunlight and nutrition, old scars rising across her body like a map of the hell she had survived. Loneliness was the hardest thing to endure. There were nights when Raven lay in her earthen hollow, listening to wind screaming through the trees and insects calling endlessly, wondering if she was still human or if she had become something else entirely, a creature of darkness and fear. She spoke to no one for months at a time, sometimes forgetting what the sound of her own voice even felt like. The only person she occasionally encountered was old Walter, an aging veteran who also lived in the forest, a gentle man with the sad eyes of someone who had seen too much suffering. They didn't talk much, only sometimes sharing food in silence, two ghosts of society sitting beside a small fire, each carrying secrets they never asked about. Walter didn't ask why Raven lived in the woods, and she didn't ask why his eyes sometimes stared into nothing with the horror of memories that couldn't be forgotten. They respected each other's silence, and to Raven, that was the greatest gift anyone could give her. She lived this way, day after day, season after season. Scorching summers filled with mosquitoes and insects, winters so cold the nights felt endless. She survived on willpower and stubbornness, on the deep fear of what waited for her beyond the forest. Because no matter how brutal life in the woods became, no matter how hungry or frozen she was, it was still a million times better than going back to Derek Lawson and the hell he called marriage. But to understand why Raven chose this feral existence instead of returning to the civilized world, one has to turn back time to the night her life first began to shatter, the night she was only 8 years old and still believed the world was a safe place. She remembered sleeping when the sound of shattering glass tore her awake. Then the smell of gasoline, thick and lethal, spreading through her family's small house. She remembered her father screaming for her mother to grab her and run, remembered her mother's arm yanking her from the bed, remembered the heat of flames already licking up the wooden walls. They ran down the stairs, but the front door had been locked from the outside. Her mother pushed her toward the kitchen window, the only one small enough for her to squeeze through but too small for an adult. Her mother kissed her forehead, tears streaming down her face, telling her to run and never look back. Then she shoved her through the window. Raven fell into the bushes outside, scraped and bleeding, and when she turned her head despite her mother's warning, she saw the flames swallow the house, saw the silhouettes of her parents inside the fire, heard their screams echo into the night. Those screams stayed with her for 19 years, returning in every nightmare, reminding her of the night she lost everything. Years later, when she was old enough to dig for answers, she learned the truth. Her father, a small-time mechanic, had refused to pay protection money to a local gang. They burned the house to teach others a lesson. No one was arrested. No one paid the price. Only the 8-year-old girl bore the consequences, thrown into the foster care system like an abandoned object. 12 families in 10 years. 12 houses she was never allowed to call home. Some families were indifferent, treating her as nothing more than income from government checks, feeding her leftovers and dressing her in worn-out clothes. Others were worse. Homes where foster fathers looked at her in ways that made her lock her bedroom door every night, where foster mothers beat her for mistakes she never made. She learned how to become invisible in those years, learned not to draw attention, learned to swallow tears in pain because no one wanted to hear an orphan complain. Then she turned 18. Old enough for the system to push her out into the world with a few $100s and a wish for good luck. She worked in a small diner, lived in a damp rented room, trying to survive one day at a time. That was when Derek Lawson entered her life like a savior. He was handsome with a charming smile, wealthy with his luxury car and expensive suits, saying sweet words she had never heard before. He told her she deserved love, deserved a better life, deserved a real home, and she, an orphan starving for affection, believed every word. They married when she was 19. For the first few months, Derek was the perfect husband, attentive and gentle, indulging her like a princess. Then things changed, slowly, like poison seeping into blood. First came small criticisms, then the first slaps he called discipline, then the beatings that left her bedridden for days. She discovered Derek wasn't a businessman as he claimed, but the head of a human trafficking ring, and she had become his property, nothing more. 6 years. 6 years imprisoned in a lavish mansion that was really a cage. 6 years of being beaten, humiliated, forced to act as bait to lure other young women into Derek's network. She hated herself for it, hated the trusting looks in those girls' eyes, hated knowing she was helping turn them into slaves like herself. But every time she refused, Derek reminded her of the price. With fists, with belts, with days locked in a dark basement without food or water. She tried to escape once, when she was 25. She planned for months, waited for a chance when Derek traveled for business, ran to the local police station, and told them everything. She didn't know Derek had bought off half the department. They called him right in front of her, and when Derek arrived to take her home with an icy smile, she knew she would pay dearly. 3 months in the basement, broken ribs, bruised flesh, and Derek telling her every day that no one was coming to save her, that she belonged to him, that death was the only thing that could free her, and he wouldn't ever allow that to happen. Then came that fateful night, the night Derek came home drunk and decided she needed another lesson. But that night, something inside Raven shattered, or maybe finally healed. When Derek's hands closed around her throat, when she felt life slipping from her body, she reached for the fruit knife on the table and stabbed. She stabbed once, then again, until Derek collapsed to the floor screaming in rage. She didn't wait to see whether he was alive or dead. She ran, with blood on her hands and terror in her heart, ran into the night, ran until her legs carried her to the edge of Blackwood Forest. And she had been there ever since, for 2 years, living like a ghost, carrying scars that would never heal, mapping the hell she had survived. Derek didn't die. She knew that. He put a bounty of $50,000 on her head, framed her as a murderer, turned her into a wanted criminal, and she knew that if he ever found her, death would be the kindest thing he would give her. The morning everything changed began like every other morning during the 2 years Raven had lived in the forest. She woke before dawn while the sky was still gray, lying motionless in the earthen hollow beneath the fallen oak, listening. 5 minutes passed in absolute silence, broken only by birds beginning to call to one another and the faint rustle of wind through the leaves. There were no human footsteps, no engines, no sign of danger. She slowly pushed the camouflage tarp aside and crawled out, her gray eyes sweeping the surroundings with the vigilance that had become instinct. She checked her water source first, drinking her fill from a plastic bottle she had hidden among rocks about 100 meters from her shelter. Then she moved to her trap line, 3 simple snare traps set along narrow trails where rabbits usually ran. The first 2 were empty, but the third had caught a young rabbit. Raven ended its life quickly and humanely, whispering thanks the way her grandfather had taught her long ago before he died, then began cleaning the animal with the knife she always kept razor sharp at her hip. She was wrapping the rabbit in leaves to carry it back when she heard movement from the trail below. Raven froze, every muscle drawn tight as wire. She slipped into the nearest brush, making herself as small as possible, and watched through the leaves. 2 figures appeared on the trail, one wearing a moss-green ranger uniform and walking with arrogant ease, the other shorter and older, his hands bound behind his back with plastic ties. Raven's heart sank when she recognized who the bound man was. Old Walter, her only friend in this forest. The ranger was Barrett. She recognized him from the warning posters posted throughout ranger stations, and more importantly from the time she had been forced to flee when he patrolled nearby. Barrett was the kind of man who savored his small authority, someone who viewed the homeless living in the woods as trash that needed to be cleared away. He shoved Walter forward hard enough that the old man nearly fell, his voice dripping with contempt as he called him a rat, a parasite fouling his forest. Walter said nothing. His frail shoulders slumped in the weary submission of someone long accustomed to being treated as disposable. Raven wanted to leap out, wanted to scream, wanted to do something to stop Barrett. Walter was a good man. He hurt no one. He only wanted to live out his remaining years in the quiet of the woods. But she couldn't move. Barrett knew her face. He had a wanted poster with her photograph, and the $50,000 reward printed beneath it. If she revealed herself, he would arrest her, turn her over to the police, and the police would hand her back to Derek. She would be dragged back to hell, this time with no chance of escape. So she stayed still in the shadows, biting her lip until she tasted blood, watching Barrett drag Walter away around the bend in the trail. She heard his laughter, heard him threaten that Walter would rot in jail, that he would make sure the old man never set foot in this forest again. Then the footsteps faded, and silence returned, heavier than ever. Raven stood there for a long time, fists clenched, nails cutting into her palms. She hated herself for this cowardice, hated that she had let her only friend be taken without doing anything. But deep down, she knew she had no other choice. She had survived for 2 years by not being a hero, by putting her own safety above everything else. And she hated herself for that even more than she hated Barrett. She swore silently that one day, men like Barrett would pay. But not today. Today, she needed to run. With Barrett patrolling this area, her shelter was no longer safe. She hurried back and gathered her few possessions. Her knife, her water bottles, her coil of paracord, the tarp, and her fire striker, all fitting neatly into the torn backpack she had found in a donation bin months earlier. She erased every trace of her existence, filled in the hollow, covered it with dry leaves, and vanished into the deep forest, as if no one had ever been there. She headed east toward the rugged mountains few people dared to enter. The terrain was harsher and food harder to find, but it was safer from men like Barrett. She didn't know that this choice would lead her to the scream of a child, to a deadly snakebite, and to an encounter that would change her life forever. The Rocky Mountains to the east of Blackwood Forest were a place even seasoned hunters hesitated to enter. The terrain was brutal, with sheer cliffs, yawning ravines, and slick slopes covered in loose stones, where one wrong step could easily become the last. But to Raven, that danger was the best kind of protection. She spent the entire morning moving deeper into the mountains, searching for a new shelter and a nearby water source so she could survive the days ahead. Around midday, when the sun was high and the heat began to press down into the stone-filled valley, Raven was climbing down a gentle slope toward a small stream whose trickling sound she could hear in the distance when the sound shattered the stillness. A scream, sharp and piercing, filled with terror, the scream of a child. Raven froze mid-step, every sense snapping instantly into high alert. The survival instincts she had trained for 2 years screamed inside her head, telling her to run, to stay away, not to get involved in anything that could threaten her safety. That scream could be a trap, could be bait set by Barrett or by Derek's people to draw her out. She had stayed alive by never taking risks, by always putting her own safety first. But the scream came again, weaker this time, more desperate, followed by the sobbing cries of a child calling for her father. And suddenly Raven was no longer on the rocky slope. She was standing outside a burning house, 8 years old, screaming for her parents while neighbors stood watching, no one daring to enter the flames to save them. She remembered that despair, the feeling of being abandoned in the moment she needed help the most. She had sworn to herself that if she ever stood where those neighbors had stood, she would never be the one who simply watched. Her legs began to move before her mind could argue, not running away but running toward the sound of crying. She found the child at the base of a low cliff, curled among loose stones, blonde hair plastered to her head with sweat and dust, a small face flushed from crying and fever, a little girl, no more than 10 years old, her expensive clothes torn and filthy, a smartwatch on her wrist glinting in the sunlight like a reminder of who she was. The child's left leg was pinned beneath a medium-sized rock, and just above the ankle, 2 bright red fang marks stood out against skin that was already swelling and turning dark purple. A rattlesnake. Raven recognized it instantly. The snake was likely gone, but its venom was spreading through that small body with every heartbeat. The child saw Raven and cried harder. Ocean blue eyes filled with tears and terror. Through broken sobs, she babbled about bad men who had stopped her car, about gunshots, about Uncle Marcus falling with blood on his chest, about running into the forest to hide and running until she slipped and fell down this cliff. She cried for her father, saying he would come save her, saying her father always came for her. Raven knelt beside the child, her mind rapidly assessing the situation. This was a rich child, very rich. That watch alone was probably worth more than everything Raven had ever owned combined. The girl had been chased, likely for ransom, and her bodyguard had been taken down. The snakebite was at least an hour old based on the swelling, maybe more. Rattlesnake venom could kill an adult within hours without treatment, and for a 10-year-old child the window was far shorter. The choice before Raven was brutally clear. She could walk away, continue on her path, keep herself safe the way she had for 2 years. This child had nothing to do with her, and the girl's father had money and power. Surely someone would come looking for her. Or she could try to save her, which meant carrying the child out of the forest, exposing herself, facing Barrett and possibly Derek. She looked down at the child's face, into those pleading blue eyes, and she saw herself 19 years earlier, the little girl standing outside a burning house, begging someone to do something. Raven said nothing. She simply began to move the rock pinning the child's leg. It was heavier than she expected, and she had to use both hands and all the strength in her thin body to shove it aside. When the rock finally rolled away, she reached down to lift the child, and her foot slipped on the loose stones. She fell, her right ankle slamming into a sharp edge of rock with a dry cracking sound. Pain exploded like fire, shooting from her ankle up to her knee, forcing Raven to clench her teeth to keep from screaming. She looked at her leg and knew instantly it was broken. The unnatural angle beneath the skin told her everything. But she didn't have time to hurt, didn't have time to panic. The child was dying, and now she had to carry her out of here on a broken leg. She drew in a deep breath, swallowed the pain the way she had swallowed so many others in her life, and began to prepare for the journey ahead. Raven tore a strip of fabric from the hem of her shirt and wrapped it tightly around Isla's leg just above the bite, tight enough to slow the blood carrying the venom through her body, but not so tight that it completely cut off circulation. She had learned this from survival books she found discarded behind the library, knowledge she never imagined she would use to save the life of a stranger's child. Then she scanned the area, searching her memory for what she knew about local plants. Her eyes settled on a low shrub clinging to the rock face, dark green leaves with distinctive serrated edges. She crawled over, grabbed a handful of leaves, chewed them into a pulp, and pressed it onto the bite on Isla's leg. It was not an antidote. Nothing could replace anti-venom, but it could slow swelling and ease the pain for the next few hours. A few hours. That was all the time Isla had. Raven stood up, or tried to. Her broken ankle screamed in protest, pain ripping from her foot to her knee, her vision blurring for a moment. She clenched her teeth, tasting blood as she bit into her lip, and forced herself upright on her good leg. She had endured Derek's beatings for 6 years, survived 3 months in a basement with broken ribs. She could endure a few more hours. She knelt in front of Isla, turned her back to the child, and spoke as calmly as she could, telling her to hold on tight around her neck and not let go no matter what happened. Isla obeyed, small arms wrapping around Raven's neck, her fever-hot body pressed against Raven's back. Raven stood, and the world tilted beneath her as the child's weight crashed down on her broken ankle. She nearly fell, but through a near-superhuman act of will, she kept her balance and began to move. Every step was torture. Every step was a blade driven through bone and flesh. Every step was a scream swallowed back into her throat. Raven moved slowly across the jagged terrain, searching for solid footing with her good leg, while the broken one dragged uselessly behind her, screaming with pain. Sweat streamed down her face, burning her eyes and blurring her vision, but she didn't dare stop to wipe it away. Every wasted second was another second. The venom spread through Isla's body. The afternoon sun burned without mercy, reflecting off gray stone and turning the mountains into a natural furnace. Her throat burned with thirst, but the nearest water was miles away, and she didn't have time to stop. Steep, rocky slopes forced her to crawl with hands and knees, Isla clinging to her back like a small monkey, the child's weight dragging her down with every inch gained. Sharp rocks sliced into her palms and knees, leaving streaks of blood along the path, but Raven barely noticed. She focused on one thing only, moving forward. Isla drifted in and out of fever, whimpering for her father, asking when they would get there, asking why it hurt so much. Each time, Raven soothed her gently, saying they were almost there, saying her father would find her, saying everything would be all right. Sweet lies she didn't know would come true, but she would say anything to keep the child calm. During one clearer moment, Isla asked Raven her name. Raven hesitated. Her name was something she had tried to bury for 2 years, but she whispered it anyway, the real name she hadn't spoken to anyone since fleeing into the forest. Isla repeated it, said it was a beautiful name, said it meant a black bird, said she liked ravens because they were smart and strong. Then Isla said her father would reward Raven, said her father was very rich and powerful and could give Raven anything she wanted. Raven thought bitterly that she didn't need money, didn't need anything from anyone. She just needed this child to survive the night. But she didn't say it. She kept walking in silence. Isla asked why Raven lived in the forest, asked if she had a home, if she had a family. It took Raven a long time to answer, her voice rough with thirst and exhaustion, saying she had no home, no family, that the forest was the only place she could go. Isla was quiet for a moment, then her small hand reached down and squeezed Raven's weakly, saying Raven could come to her house, saying her house was very big with many empty rooms, saying her father would never let a good person live in the woods. Raven didn't answer, but her eyes burned and something warm spread through her chest, a feeling she had forgotten long ago. She kept moving, one step after another, toward the highway she knew lay to the northwest. How far it was she couldn't be sure. Maybe 3 miles, maybe 4, but she would reach it or die on the way. She wouldn't let this child die. She wouldn't let history repeat itself. Hours passed inside an unending nightmare. The sun had begun to tilt westward, late afternoon light stretching long across the treetops, when Raven finally saw what she had been searching for all day. Through a break in the leaves, the highway appeared like a gray ribbon cutting across the base of the hill, cars occasionally sliding past with a soft hiss through the air. Less than half a mile, just half a mile more and she could flag someone down, could get Isla to a hospital, could save the fragile life fading against her back. Raven almost cried with relief. Her legs had gone numb long ago. The pain from her broken ankle had passed beyond anything recognizable and turned into something hollow, as if her body had given up trying to warn her because it knew she wouldn't stop no matter what. Isla lay motionless against her, hot, shallow breaths brushing Raven's neck, small arms still looped around her shoulders but drained of strength hours earlier. Raven stepped out of the tree line, the glare of afternoon sun forcing her to squint after so many hours beneath dense cover. Just a few 100 meters more, she told herself. Just a few 100 meters. That was when a figure stepped out of the brush to her right and cut her off. Ranger Barrett stood there, a triumphant smile spreading across his coarse face, his pistol already drawn and aimed straight at her. He spoke with satisfaction, saying he had been waiting all day, saying he knew she would have to come to the main road if she wanted the child to live. He said he followed the trail of blood she left behind, drop by drop, like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale. Raven collapsed to her knees, her legs finally refusing to hold her up for another second. She kept Isla clutched tightly to her chest, shielding the child with her own body even though she knew it was meaningless against a gun. She begged Barrett, her voice raw with exhaustion and desperation, asking him to let her take the child to the hospital first, saying she would turn herself in afterward, saying she wouldn't run, begging for just one more hour to save the life of this innocent child. Barrett laughed, the sound of someone who believed victory was already his. He said Derek was on his way, said $50,000 would solve a lot of his problems, gambling debts, angry creditors, all of it disappearing. As for the child, he shrugged indifferently and said he didn't care whether she lived or died, that it wasn't his problem. Raven looked down at Isla, at the small pale face, cracked dry lips, eyes sealed shut in unconsciousness. The child had trusted her, had squeezed her hand and said Raven could come home with her. And now, after everything Raven had endured, after 4 miles on a broken leg, she was supposed to let this child die in front of her for one greedy man and $50,000. Barrett's gun barrel caught the late afternoon light as he leveled it at her, finger tightening on the trigger as he ordered her to put the child down. And then, from far away, a sound began to rise, the roar of engines, growing closer and louder, like thunder announcing a storm that was finally coming. Raven opened her eyes, and for the first moment she had no idea where she was. A ceiling of pure white, soft fluorescent light, the steady beep of a heart monitor pulsing beside her ear, like a monotonous rhythm that somehow felt reassuring. She blinked several times, trying to anchor herself in this unfamiliar space. The scent of antiseptic, fresh flowers, clean fabric, all of it was painfully foreign to a woman who had lived in the forest for 2 years. A woman accustomed to the smell of damp earth, rotting leaves, and her own sweat. She was lying in a hospital bed, white sheets tucked around her, a soft blanket covering her body, her head resting on a plush pillow. For the first time in 2 years, she was lying on a real bed, not an earthen hollow lined with pine needles, not the frozen forest floor. Her right ankle was encased in a cast, elevated on a special cushion, and an IV line ran from her arm to a clear bag hanging on a metal stand. On the table beside her bed stood a vase of fresh white roses, their gentle fragrance filling the air, and she wondered if this was a dream or if hell had simply changed its shape. Memory crashed over her like a tidal wave. Isla. The snakebite. 4 miles on a broken leg. Barrett and the gun. The black convoy. The man with icy blue eyes clutching the child. Then darkness, and nothing more. She tried to sit up, survival instinct, screaming that she shouldn't be here, that she needed to leave before someone realized who she was, before Derek found her. But her body refused to cooperate. Weak and spent from everything it had endured, she had barely lifted herself halfway when the hospital room door opened and a woman stepped inside. Her hair was snow white, neatly pinned at the nape of her neck, her face lined with time yet still carrying an air of grace and authority. Her eyes were sharp and deep blue like the open ocean, the same eyes as the man from the black SUV, but softened by a warmth and kindness his gaze lacked. She wore an elegant charcoal gray dress, a simple pearl necklace at her throat, radiating the quiet refinement of someone born into privilege. She pulled a chair to Raven's bedside and sat down, her movements unhurried and gentle, as if she had all the time in the world. She introduced herself in a low, calm voice, saying her name was Margaret Ashford, Isla's grandmother, and that she had come to thank the woman who saved her granddaughter's life. Raven said nothing, unsure how to respond. She wasn't used to gratitude, wasn't used to hearing someone thank her. All her life, she had been the one things were taken from, the one used and discarded, never the one who gave and was acknowledged. Margaret continued, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke of Isla. She said her granddaughter had pulled through, that the doctors said another half hour would have been too late, that the venom was already nearing her heart when the helicopter landed at the hospital. Without Raven, without the 4 miles she walked on a broken leg, Isla would have died. She said there were no words sufficient to express the Ashford family's gratitude. Raven lowered her head, avoiding her gaze. She murmured that she had only done what anyone would do, that she didn't need thanks. But Margaret shook her head and said not everyone would have done the same, that many would have walked away to protect themselves, and that she understood that better than most, because she knew exactly what Raven was running from. Raven looked up, gray eyes widening in shock. What could this woman possibly know about her? Margaret met her gaze with an expression that was both compassionate and unyielding. She said the Ashford family had resources few could imagine, and when they learned that a wanted woman had risked her life to save Isla, the first thing they did was investigate. She said she knew about the warrant, and that she also knew it was fabricated, bought with the money of a man named Derek Lawson, a monster in human form who trafficked women and children. Raven's heart seemed to stop in her chest. Derek. The name slid into her veins like poison, making her want to curl inward and disappear. She asked in a trembling voice what Margaret knew. Margaret took Raven's hand, her grip warm and steady, and said she knew everything. She knew about the fire that killed Raven's parents when she was 8 years old, a fire set by a gang because her father refused to pay protection money. She knew about the 12 foster families who never gave her a real home, about the years of neglect and abuse inside a system that was supposed to protect her. She knew about Derek Lawson and the 6-year marriage that was a living hell, about the beatings, the basement, the trafficking ring Raven was forced to be part of. And she knew about the night Raven stabbed Derek in self-defense and fled into the forest with blood on her hands. Tears began to stream down Raven's face, the first she had shed in 2 years, perhaps longer. She hadn't cried when Derek beat her, hadn't cried when she was locked in the basement, hadn't cried alone in the frozen forest. But now, with someone finally seeing her, truly seeing her with all her scars and pain, she couldn't hold them back. Margaret squeezed her hand tighter and said something that broke Raven's heart and mended it in the same breath. She said it was time for Raven to stop running, that she had run long enough, and that now she had someone standing on her side. 2 days passed in the hospital. 2 days Raven spent mostly sleeping and healing. Her body utterly depleted after years of deprivation finally allowed real rest. Nurses came daily to change the dressing on her ankle. Bringing hot meals she finished down to the last bite while trying to maintain a calm exterior. Margaret visited every afternoon, bringing books and fresh flowers, sitting by Raven's bed and talking about how well Isla was recovering, about how the little girl kept asking about the woman who saved her. Raven listened but spoke little, still unaccustomed to this attention, still waiting for the moment it would all vanish and she would be left alone to face the world again. On the 3rd day, when Raven could move with crutches despite the pain and limp, she began planning her departure. She couldn't stay here forever, couldn't rely on the kindness of strangers, couldn't allow herself to grow weak or dependent. She had survived alone for 2 years and she could continue to do so. She was folding the clothes the hospital had provided, preparing to pack them into the small plastic bag holding her personal belongings, when the door opened. Lucian Ashford stepped inside, and the room seemed to shrink under his presence. He was still dressed in black, still tall and commanding, but without the armed entourage, without the lethal coldness she had seen when he faced Barrett. Today, he was simply a man entering a hospital room alone, his blue eyes no longer icy but holding something she couldn't read. He looked at the bag on the bed, at the clothes in her hands, and didn't need to ask what she intended to do. He pulled the chair Margaret usually sat in closer and took a seat, remaining silent for a moment as if weighing every word. Then he spoke, his voice low and measured, saying Isla wanted to see her, that the child kept asking about the woman named Raven, who carried her across the mountains, that she cried when she heard Raven was injured, saving her. Raven set the clothes aside but didn't sit, keeping distance by leaning against the bed frame. She said as evenly as she could that she didn't need to see anyone, that she was glad Isla had recovered, but she would leave as soon as she could walk. She thanked him and his family for caring for her, but said she didn't want to be a burden any longer. Lucian studied her, blue eyes piercing as if reading every thought in her head. He asked where she planned to go, his tone not accusatory but quietly curious. Back to the forest, perhaps, to continue living like a wild animal until Derek found her or winter killed her instead. Raven clenched her jaw, stung by his brutal honesty but unable to deny the truth in his words. She said it was her life, her choice, and it had nothing to do with him or his family. She had taken care of herself for 2 years, and she could keep doing it. Lucian didn't show anger or irritation at her stubbornness. Instead, he stood, walked to the bedside cabinet, and placed a brown folder on top, one she hadn't seen him carrying. He told her to open it before making any decisions. Raven hesitated, then curiosity won. She opened the folder and her heart nearly stopped when she saw what was inside. A complete set of identification documents, a driver's license, a social security card, a birth certificate, a passport, all bearing the name Raven Blackwood, her face, but an entirely different history. No criminal record, no warrant, no blood-stained past. A clean new existence, as if Raven Cole had never existed at all. She looked up at Lucian, unable to speak. He explained calmly that the Ashford family had certain connections, resources, beyond the reach of ordinary people. Raven Cole, the woman wanted for murder, had died in a car accident in Mexico 3 days earlier, at least according to official police records. The woman standing before him now was Raven Blackwood, an ordinary citizen with no troubling past. Raven felt the room spin. She asked what he wanted in return. Her voice edged with suspicion, because she had learned long ago that nothing in this world was free, that every gift carried a price. Lucian regarded her for a long moment before answering that he wanted to offer her a job. The Ashford family owned a large forested estate outside the city, and they needed someone to manage the land. Someone with survival skills, knowledge of wilderness terrain, someone who could train security staff to operate in rugged conditions. She would receive a salary, housing on the estate grounds, and most importantly, the protection of the Ashford family, which meant Derek Lawson would never be able to touch her again. Raven shook her head, still struggling to believe what she was hearing. She asked why he would do all this for a woman he had met only once. Lucian stood and walked toward the door but stopped before opening it. He turned back and answered quietly that he wanted his daughter to be happy, and Isla wouldn't be happy knowing the woman who saved her life had been forced back into the forest like a hunted animal. He added that he also owed Raven a debt, one no amount of money could ever repay. He told her to think about his offer, that she didn't need to answer immediately, but he hoped she would give herself a chance to live instead of merely survive. Then he left, leaving Raven alone with the folder in her hands and thousands of questions spinning through her mind. She looked down at the name Raven Blackwood on the driver's license, at her own face in the photograph yet belonging to someone entirely different. And for the first time in 2 years, she allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't involve running. Raven lay awake through that night, and the next, and the one after, the folder bearing the name Raven Blackwood, resting on the bedside table like an invitation that was both tempting and terrifying. She was used to running, used to trusting no one, used to believing that every hand offered carried hidden claws. During 2 years in the forest, she had built a wall around herself, thick and unyielding, to protect a heart she believed was shattered beyond repair. And now, a stranger was offering to tear that wall down, inviting her to step out of the darkness she had come to call home. She thought of Blackwood Forest, of the hollow beneath the fallen oak, of winters that cut to the bone and summers that burned without mercy. She thought of continuing to run, to hide, to live like a ghost, until Derek found her, or until she died alone in the deep woods, unseen and unmourned. Then she thought of Isla, of those trusting blue eyes, of the small hand that had squeezed hers and said she could come home with her. She thought of Margaret and the kindness in her gaze when she said it was time to stop running. She thought of Lucian and his words that he wanted her to have a chance to live rather than merely survive. By the third night, Raven made her decision. Not for the money, not for the safety the new identity promised, but because for the first time in her life, someone had looked at her as a human being, not a victim to be pitied, not a criminal to be punished, not prey to be hunted. They looked at her and saw a woman who had risked her life to save a stranger's child, and they wanted to give her a chance. Maybe she would regret it. Maybe this was just another elaborate trap. But she was tired of running, tired of being afraid, tired of existing instead of truly living. The next morning, when Ghost arrived to pick her up in a gleaming black SUV, Raven was ready. She had nothing with her but the clothes she wore and the folder containing her new identity. But that didn't matter. She was used to starting from nothing. The drive took about an hour, through the city and out toward the outskirts, along roads that grew quieter and lined with thicker trees. When the vehicle stopped before a massive iron gate surrounded by an electric fence, Raven knew she was stepping into an entirely different world. The gate opened after Ghost scanned a card and spoke briefly into a radio, and the SUV rolled forward along a winding gravel road through the estate's private forest. The Ashford estate appeared before her like a dream, or perhaps like a world she had never known existed. The main house was a 3-story Victorian mansion, red brick walls draped in green ivy, tall, wide windows reflecting the morning sun. Around it lay meticulously kept gardens, marble fountains, and beyond them a private forest stretching all the way to the horizon. Security was everywhere yet discreet. Men in black suits stationed at key points, surveillance cameras hidden among the trees, electronic fencing enclosing the entire property. This place was safer than a military base. And for the first time in 2 years, Raven felt the defensive wall inside her loosen slightly. Ghost didn't take her to the main house but drove around behind it, deeper into the estate forest for several more minutes, until a small house appeared among the trees. It was a single-story cabin, with a wooden roof and a wide porch, not large but warm and inviting, set at the edge of the property where the estate's forest met the natural woods beyond, close enough to be protected, far enough not to feel confined, close enough to the forest that she could run if she ever needed to. She wondered whether this was coincidence, or whether someone had chosen this place for her on purpose. She had just stepped out of the SUV, her ankle still aching despite the cast being replaced with a brace, when a shout rang out from the direction of the main house. Raven turned and saw Isla running toward her, blonde hair flying in the wind, small feet pounding along the gravel path despite the ankle that was still healing. Behind her, a young woman Raven assumed was the nanny struggled to keep up. Isla threw herself into Raven, small arms wrapping tightly around her waist with the surprising strength of a 10-year-old. She talked without stopping, her voice bright with excitement and joy, saying how much she had missed Raven, how she had counted the days waiting for her to arrive, how she was going to show Raven her room and her secret garden and her cat named Whiskers. She said Raven would teach her how to live in the forest like a native, that they would be best friends, that she would never let Raven be lonely again. Raven stood frozen, unsure how to respond. She wasn't used to physical closeness, wasn't used to being held with affection instead of violence. For years, every touch had meant pain, and her body had learned to recoil from contact. But Isla's embrace carried no pain. It was warm, sincere, filled with a child's unguarded trust in the woman who saved her life. Slowly, very slowly, Raven lifted her arms and awkwardly returned the hug. She didn't remember how to hold anyone, had forgotten what tenderness felt like, but she tried. Isla squeezed tighter, as if afraid Raven might vanish if she let go, and something inside Raven's chest softened, a piece of the wall she had built over so many years beginning to crack. For the first time in many years, someone touched her without causing pain. And for the first time in many years, Raven allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved to be loved. The first weeks at the Ashford estate were a battle without gunfire that Raven faced every day. A battle against the survival habits that had sunk deep into her bones during 2 years in the forest. She was not used to sleeping on a soft bed. Her body felt unsettled and exposed on a mattress instead of hard ground. And many nights she woke in panic, not knowing where she was, her heart pounding as if it would burst until she realized she was safe in the small house at the forest's edge. She was not used to regular meals either, her stomach tightening in protest against the rich food sent from the main kitchen, and she had to force herself to eat small portions until her body slowly relearned how to accept nourishment. Nightmares still came, dreams of Derek in the basement, of fire consuming her parents, of screaming and the smell of blood. But gradually they came less often, and there were nights when she slept 4 or 5 hours straight without waking in terror. Isla visited her every day like a small storm sweeping into the quiet house, bringing laughter and warmth Raven had never realized she was missing so deeply. The girl pulled her out of her shell little by little, demanding stories about the forest, about setting rabbit traps, about edible plants, and the ones that could kill you. Isla listened with shining eyes as if Raven were telling the most thrilling fairy tales in the world, and she wanted to learn everything. They walked through the estate forest together, Raven teaching Isla how to read animal tracks, how to find water, how to tell direction by the moss on tree trunks. In those afternoons, when sunlight filtered through the leaves and fell on 2 figures walking side by side, one tall and one small, Raven felt something inside her beginning to heal, slowly but surely. Chloe Martinez, the young woman Raven had seen chasing after Isla on her first day, became her first friend in this new life. Chloe was Isla's nanny and the estate house manager, a woman of 28 with curly brown hair and an easy smile. Someone who was not intimidated by Raven's reserve or distance. She appeared at Raven's door with small excuses, sometimes bringing food and saying the kitchen had made too much, sometimes asking if Raven wanted to go for a walk, sometimes simply sitting on the porch drinking tea and talking about things that did not matter. Chloe taught Raven things she had forgotten or never learned: how to cook a simple meal in the small kitchen, how to choose clothes for a trip into the city, how to watch a movie without staying alert to every sound. Chloe did not ask about Raven's past, did not pry into the scars on her body or question why she startled at every loud noise. She was simply there, patient and warm, as if befriending a woman who had emerged broken from the forest was the most natural thing in the world. Margaret also played a vital role in Raven's recovery, though in a different way. She visited once a week, not to inspect or supervise, but to teach what she called the art of living as a free woman. She taught Raven how to stand straight and meet another person's eyes when speaking, not with defiance or fear, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knows her worth. She taught her how to say no without guilt, how to set boundaries and defend them, how to trust her instincts without letting fear rule every decision. Margaret told Raven she was not prey, not a victim, not merely a survivor. She was a woman who had walked through hell and was still standing, and that deserved respect, not pity. As for Lucian, He remained a mystery Raven could not unravel. He kept a polite distance, and they did not meet often. Mostly when it involved Isla or during the rare family dinners Margaret insisted on hosting. He did not speak much to Raven, did not ask how she was adjusting or how she lived, but she began to notice the quiet things he did. Every morning when she woke, a cup of hot coffee was already waiting on her porch, and no one ever admitted to bringing it. In the small bookshelf inside her house, books on wilderness survival and herbal medicine appeared as if they had always been there, books she had not ordered and no one claimed to have gifted. The family's private doctor checked her ankle regularly, saying it was an order from above without clarifying who that authority was. And sometimes, in the evenings, when Raven stood on her porch looking toward the main mansion, she saw a figure standing at a second-floor window, watching in the direction of her house, then disappearing when she tried to focus. Someone was watching over her from a distance, protecting her without asking for acknowledgement. And Raven did not know how she was supposed to feel about that. She was used to relying only on herself, used to never leaning on anyone, used to believing that all care came with a price. But this care was different. It asked for nothing, demanded nothing. It simply existed like sunlight and air, natural and without explanation. And though she did not want to admit it, it made her feel safe in a way she had never felt in her entire life. 3 months passed like a dream Raven hardly dared to believe was real. She had begun to grow accustomed to this new life, to waking up in a warm house instead of a cold earthen hollow, to Isla's laughter every afternoon, to quiet conversations over tea with Chloe, to the sense of safety she thought she had lost forever. Her ankle had healed completely, leaving only a small scar and an ache that returned when the weather turned cold. She had begun real work, training the estate's security team in wilderness survival, in moving without sound, in reading the subtle signs of nature. She had purpose, value, a reason to wake up each morning, and for the first time in many years, she allowed herself to think that maybe the nightmare was over. But nightmares never truly end. They only hide in the dark, waiting for the moment you lower your guard to return. That evening began as normally as any other. Raven was sitting on her porch reading a book on herbal medicine that someone had quietly placed on her shelf, enjoying the cool breeze and the chorus of insects in the forest, when the phone Chloe had insisted she carry vibrated on the table. A message from an unknown number. No name, only a photograph and a short line of text. Raven opened it and the blood in her veins seemed to freeze. The photo showed her and Isla walking through the estate forest, taken from far away as if through a telephoto lens. The angle revealing the photographer had been somewhere outside the security fence, yet still close enough to see them clearly. Isla was laughing, pointing at a squirrel on a branch, and Raven was smiling down at her with a tenderness she had never known she possessed. The picture was recent, taken only days ago when they had gone into the woods to gather herbs. The words beneath it were brief but enough to shatter the world Raven had built over the past 3 months. Derek misses you. I'm coming to bring you home soon. The phone slipped from Raven's hand and clattered onto the wooden floor, but she didn't hear it. All she heard was the roar of blood in her ears and the hammering of her heart. Derek. Derek had found her. He knew where she was, who she lived with, how attached she had become to the blonde-haired child. And he would come, as he always promised, as he always did. And this time, he wouldn't only punish her. Raven shot to her feet, her mind spinning in panic. But the survival instincts honed over 2 years in the forest took control at once. She had to leave. Now. Before Derek arrived. Before he hurt Isla or anyone in the Ashford family. If she stayed, he would come, and the people who had sheltered her would pay for their kindness. She couldn't let that happen. Couldn't let anyone else be hurt because of her. She rushed inside, dragged out the old backpack she still kept under the bed, and began stuffing it with the essentials for life in the wild. The knife, the rope, the fire starter, the water bottle. Her hands shook, but she forced herself to focus, forced herself not to think about Isla and her smile, not about Chloe and their afternoons of tea, not about Margaret and her lessons on living as a free woman, not about Lucian and the hot coffee every morning. She couldn't think of them, because if she did, she wouldn't be able to leave, and if she didn't leave, they would die. She was pulling the zipper closed when the door flew open and Chloe stood there, hair disheveled as if she had run, eyes wide with shock at the sight before her. She asked what Raven was doing, her voice tight with worry, and when her gaze fell on the backpack, the worry turned to alarm. She asked where Raven was going, why she was packing in the middle of the night. Raven didn't want to explain, didn't want to speak, didn't want anyone to know about the photo and the threat on her phone, but Chloe wouldn't let her stay silent. She stepped inside, closed the door, and looked at Raven with the resolve of someone who had no intention of letting her friend run alone into the night. Under that gaze, Raven's defenses collapsed, and she told her everything. About Derek, about the message, about the photo of her and Isla, about how he had found her and was coming to take her back, about how she had to leave before he hurt anyone. Chloe listened in silence, and when Raven finished, she said something that made Raven stop mid-motion. Chloe asked if Raven knew who she was living with, if she knew what kind of man Lucian Ashford was, if she truly believed a trafficker like Derek Lawson could threaten the most powerful family on the east coast of America. Chloe said Raven didn't have to run, didn't have to face the darkness alone anymore, because she hadn't been alone since the moment she carried Isla out of that forest. Raven looked at Chloe, at the certainty in her eyes, and for the first time since the message arrived, the panic eased slightly, but the fear remained, deep and ancient. The fear that anyone who came close to her would be hurt, the fear that she didn't deserve protection, the fear that Derek would always find her and drag her back to hell. She told Chloe she couldn't let Isla be endangered because of her, couldn't let the Ashfords pay for her mistakes. Chloe shook her head and said that wasn't Raven's decision alone, that Lucian needed to know, and that she was taking Raven to see him right now whether Raven wanted to or not. Chloe pulled Raven along the gravel path toward the main mansion despite her weak protests. It was late, close to midnight, yet the light was still on in Lucian's office on the second floor, and Chloe seemed certain her employer would still be awake. They crossed the lavishly decorated main hall, climbed the gleaming oak staircase, and stopped before the heavy double doors of dark walnut. Chloe knocked twice, short and firm, and Lucian's deep voice sounded from inside, allowing them to enter. Lucian Ashford's study was as large as the entire apartment Raven had once lived in before Derek, with bookshelves stretching to the ceiling, a massive mahogany desk, and tall windows overlooking the forest behind the estate. Lucian sat behind the desk, his suit jacket draped over the back of his chair, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing strong forearms marked with the faint outline of his family crest in the warm light. When he saw the two women enter, his blue eyes moved from Chloe to Raven, and she could tell he knew instantly that something was wrong. Chloe briefly explained that Raven had something important to tell him, then stepped back out and closed the door, leaving Raven alone in the room with a man she still couldn't fully understand. Lucian said nothing, only gestured for her to sit in the chair opposite his desk and waited. His silence wasn't oppressive, only patient, as if he had all night to listen to whatever she needed to say. Raven sat down, her hands clenched together in her lap to keep them from trembling. Then she began to speak, from the beginning, from the things Margaret may already have told him, but that he needed to hear from her own mouth. She told him about Derek, about the marriage from hell, about the trafficking ring, about 6 years of captivity and abuse, about the night she stabbed her husband in self-defense and fled into the forest. She told him about 2 years of living like a ghost, about the fabricated warrant, about the $50,000 bounty Derek had put on her head. Finally, she handed him her phone and showed him the photograph and the threatening message she had just received. When she finished, she told Lucian she would leave, that she couldn't stay here and put Isla and his entire family in danger. Derek was insane. He wouldn't stop until he had her, and anyone standing between him and her would be crushed. She had already brought enough trouble to the Ashfords, and the debt he said he owed her had been repaid in full. She asked him to let her go. Lucian listened the entire time without interrupting, his face unreadable, his blue eyes never leaving hers for a second. When she stopped speaking, he was silent for a long moment. Long enough for Raven to begin thinking he was weighing how to tell her he agreed, and that she should leave as soon as possible. But when he finally spoke, his voice was cold as ice and hard as steel, and his words were nothing like she expected. He said Derek Lawson had violated his territory. He said Derek had sent people to surveil his estate, photograph his daughter, threaten someone under his protection. He said this was no longer Raven's problem. This was a matter for the Ashford Syndicate, and the Ashford Syndicate never allowed anyone to insult their family without consequence. Raven shook her head and said she wasn't his, that she was just a stranger he had generously taken in, that he had no obligation to protect her or go to war with a deranged trafficker because of her. Lucian stood, walked around the desk, and stopped in front of her. He didn't touch her, but his presence filled the space between them, solid and unyielding as a cliff face. He looked straight into her eyes and said, in a voice that didn't allow argument, that she had been his from the moment she carried his daughter 4 miles on a broken ankle, from the moment she risked her life for a child she had never met, from the moment she gave Isla a reason to believe there were still good people in this world. He said no one was allowed to threaten his people, and Derek Lawson would learn that lesson in the most painful way possible. Then he turned back to his desk, picked up the phone, and began to make calls. Over the next half hour, Raven sat in silence and watched the machinery of the Ashford Syndicate come to life. Lucian called Ghost, ordered estate security raised to the highest level, and assigned round-the-clock protection for Raven. He called people he referred to as specialists, ordered a full investigation into Derek's trafficking operation. Every warehouse, every accomplice, every transaction from the past 10 years. He called someone he described as a contact at the FBI and proposed an information exchange on a major trafficking ring in return for legal protection for a key witness. When he finally set the phone down, he turned to Raven and told her she wouldn't be running anymore. Not because he forbade it, but because it was no longer necessary. Derek Lawson had chosen the wrong enemy when he decided to threaten the Ashford family, and he would soon understand his fatal mistake. He told her to go home, to rest, and to trust that from now on she had an entire empire standing behind her. Raven looked at the man before her, at the certainty in his eyes, at the way he was willing to declare war on a dangerous enemy because of her, and for the first time in her life she didn't know what to say. She was used to fighting alone, used to having no one on her side, used to protecting herself because no one else would. But tonight, in this study, she realized she wasn't alone anymore, and that realization was both terrifying and unbearably warm. Raven refused to sit still while others fought on her behalf. The very next day, she went to Lucian's office and told him she knew Derek, knew how he operated, knew his weaknesses, and the shadows he tried to hide. She had lived with him for 6 years, had been forced to participate in his trafficking network, had seen faces and heard names no one outside ever knew. She could provide information, locations of warehouses, lists of accomplices, transport schedules, everything she had memorized in silence throughout those years, in hell, with the fragile hope that one day it might matter. Lucian initially refused, saying it was too dangerous, that she needed to stay put and let his people handle it. But Raven looked straight into his eyes and said in the firmest voice she had ever used with anyone that she had run long enough, that this was her fight, her nightmare, and she had the right to fight to end it. She didn't need to be protected like a priceless object behind glass. She needed the chance to face the demon and defeat him. Something in her eyes, perhaps the resolve or the fire that had smoldered for 2 years and finally ignited, made Lucian fall silent and then nod in agreement. In the weeks that followed, they spent more time together than at any point since Raven arrived at the estate. Every day she sat in his office, drawing maps of the locations Derek used, naming accomplices she could remember, describing how the network functioned. And in the pauses between tense discussions, they began to talk about other things that had nothing to do with Derek or the coming war. Lucian told her about Helena, his wife, the woman he had loved since they were teenagers, and lost when she gave birth to Isla. He told her about that night, the night he should have been at her side in the delivery room but was instead dealing with a gang war on the other side of the city. He told her about the phone call saying Helena had died from hemorrhaging, about holding his newborn daughter and swearing he'd never lose anyone again. He told her about 10 years of freezing his heart, refusing closeness, building walls around himself, because he was terrified that if he loved again, he'd lose that person too. Raven listened, then told him things she had never told anyone. She spoke of nights locked in the basement, of staying sane by counting the bricks in the wall. 342 bricks, a number she remembered as clearly as her own name. She spoke of creating a world in her mind to escape reality, of stories she told herself in the dark, of the fragile belief that one day she'd get out. She spoke of the night she stabbed Derek, of the blood on her hands, of the feeling that was both freedom and terror as she ran into the forest without knowing if she'd live or die. They didn't speak of love. They didn't need to. The understanding between two broken souls went beyond language. Lucian understood Raven's pain because he carried invisible scars of his own. Raven understood Lucian's loneliness because she had built similar walls. They were two imperfect fragments, and somehow, when they were together, the sharp edges hurt less. Isla was the first to notice the change. The 10-year-old had sharper eyes than people assumed, and she began to see small things, the way her father looked at Raven when he thought no one was watching, the way Raven truly smiled when he entered the room, the way they stood a little closer each day without realizing it themselves. One evening, as Raven sat on the porch reading, Isla sat beside her and said in a child's voice that was strangely serious that she wished Raven would stay forever, that she wanted Raven to be her mother. Raven froze, not knowing how to answer. She had never believed she deserved to be anyone's mother, had never believed she could give love she had never received. But when she looked into Isla's hopeful blue eyes, her heart ached in a completely different way, not with suffering, but with something she didn't dare name. Derek didn't wait to be hunted. He struck first. On the third night after Lucian declared war, choosing the exact moment he knew the guard would be thinnest, the shift changed between two security teams when the estate was at its most vulnerable. He had studied it carefully, likely through Barrett before the ranger vanished without a trace. and he knew precisely which weakness to exploit. Raven was asleep in the small house at the edge of the forest when the first explosion tore through the night. She jolted awake instantly, survival instincts sharpened by 2 years in the wild activating before her mind could fully register what was happening. More gunfire erupted from the direction of the main mansion, mixed with shouting and the sound of shattering glass. Through the window, she saw flames flare somewhere on the estate grounds, and figures running wildly in the dark like ants when their nest is crushed. Isla. That was the only thought in Raven's mind, as she grabbed the knife she kept beside her bed every night, an old habit she couldn't break, and ran outside. She moved through the darkness toward the main mansion, avoiding lit areas where security lights still worked, flowing through the shadows as if she were part of them. The gunfire grew closer, and she heard unfamiliar male voices shouting orders and responses, the language of war she had never learned but instinctively understood. She reached the back of the mansion and climbed to the second-floor balcony using a vine-covered trellis whose position she had unconsciously memorized during a walk with Isla. The girl's bedroom was at the end of the hall, and when Raven pushed the window open and slipped inside, she saw Isla curled on the bed, blue eyes wide with terror, clutching Whiskers the cat as if he were her only lifeline in the storm. Raven said nothing. She rushed to the bed, pulled Isla into her arms, and pressed a finger to her lips for silence. The child understood immediately, swallowed her sobs, and let Raven guide her. They couldn't use the main exits. Gunshots and footsteps echoed throughout the mansion as intruders searched room by room. Raven led Isla back to the bedroom window overlooking the forest behind the estate and helped her climb down the trellis Raven had just used. When their feet hit the ground, Raven hoisted Isla onto her back and ran, not toward the main gate where the fighting surely was, but into the forest, into the darkness, into territory she knew better than anyone chasing them. She heard shouts behind her, someone spotting them and ordering pursuit, but she didn't look back. She just ran, barefoot over rotting leaves and roots, her old ankle screaming in protest but ignored. They vanished into the woods and Raven used every skill she'd learned during 2 years as a ghost. She moved silently, avoided brittle branches, chose paths no ordinary person would consider. She misled pursuers by throwing stones in opposite directions, leaving false trails leading to dead ends, then doubling back along unexpected routes. She set quick traps with vines and branches, crude but effective enough to slow anyone who blundered into them. Tonight the darkness was her ally, and this forest was her domain. But Isla was only 10 years old. She was exhausted, terrified, and no matter how hard she tried to stay quiet, she couldn't stop her ragged breathing and muffled sobs. They'd made it about a mile into the woods when Raven realized the child couldn't go any farther. She stopped in a rocky hollow she'd once used during her early days at the estate, when she still instinctively sought emergency shelter, and gently set Isla down. The girl trembled in her arms, tears streaming down her cheeks as she whispered broken questions about where her father was, what was happening, who the bad men were. Raven held her tighter and told her everything would be all right, told her father would come, told her she'd protect Isla at any cost. But deep inside, she knew Derek wouldn't stop. He knew her too well. He knew how she moved. He knew she'd run into the forest. And he'd come himself to end it. And she was right. Footsteps sounded in the darkness, slow and confident, the stride of someone who didn't need to hurry because he knew his prey couldn't escape. Raven pushed Isla behind her, tightened her grip on the knife, and waited as the terrifyingly familiar silhouette emerged between the trees. Derek Lawson stepped out of the darkness like a nightmare given flesh, taller and broader than Raven remembered. Or perhaps her memory had tried to shrink him to make him less terrifying. He wore a black leather jacket, a gun held loosely in his hand as if he didn't need to hurry because he knew his prey couldn't run anymore. His face was exactly as she remembered, cruelly handsome with a smile that never reached his eyes, and the long scar on his neck, a souvenir from the night she stabbed him, gleamed in the moonlight like a reminder of the debt he had come to collect. He stopped a few meters away, his gaze sliding from Raven to Isla, and back to Raven, with the relish of a predator savoring fear. He said he'd waited 2 years for this moment. 2 years of hunting. 2 years of counting the days until he found her. He said she thought she could escape, thought hiding behind a Mafia boss would protect her. But she was wrong. No one could keep her from him. She belonged to him, and he'd take her back even if he had to kill anyone who stood between them. Then his eyes shifted to Isla trembling behind Raven, and his smile turned even more vicious. He said he'd kill the child first, right in front of Raven, to teach her the price of running and dragging others into her war. Then he'd take Raven home, and this time he'd make sure she never had a chance to run again. Raven stood in front of Isla, the knife in her hand, her body shielding the child like a shield of bone and flesh. She had no other weapon, no escape, no backup, But she had something Derek had never understood, something he'd tried and failed to crush for 6 years. She wasn't afraid of death anymore. She'd died long ago. Died in that basement. Died on the frozen forest paths. Died every night when nightmares dragged her back into hell. What stood before Derek now wasn't the terrified 24-year-old girl from the past. This was a woman who'd survived 2 winters in the wild, who'd carried a child 4 miles on a broken leg, who'd learned to make the darkness her ally. She spoke to Derek in a voice strangely calm, the voice of someone who'd accepted fate but refused to bow to it. She said he could kill her, maybe he would, but he wouldn't touch Isla. She said she wasn't the girl he'd broken, not the puppet he controlled with fear. She'd walked through hell and was still standing, and he had no power over her anymore. Derek roared in rage, his handsome face twisting with fury as he raised the gun and aimed it at Isla. He screamed that he'd show her who had the power, that he'd shoot the child dead in front of her and drag Raven home over the body. Raven lunged at him with the knife raised, not to kill him because she knew she didn't stand a chance, but to force him to shoot her first, to keep him from touching Isla. But before she could reach him, before Derek could pull the trigger, a gunshot cracked from the darkness behind him. Derek jerked. The gun fell from his hand, and he collapsed to the ground with a scream as blood poured from his right shoulder where the bullet tore through. He rolled on the leaf-covered ground, clutching the wound, eyes wide with the terror of a man realizing for the first time that he wasn't the strongest player in this game. Lucian Ashford stepped out from between the trees, his gun still trained on Derek, his face cold as ice in the moonlight. Behind him were Ghost and a team of heavily armed guards, sealing the area in deadly silence. He said nothing to Derek. He didn't need to. His icy blue stare said everything. He simply stepped past him as if stepping over roadside trash and went straight to Raven and Isla. Isla burst into tears and ran into her father's arms, small hands clutching his neck as if afraid he'd disappear if she let go. Lucian held his daughter with one arm, his eyes never leaving Raven, and she saw in his gaze what he didn't say: relief, worry, and something deeper and warmer she didn't dare name. Then he extended his free hand toward her, not to pull her in, but to invite her, to give her the choice. And Raven, the woman who hadn't trusted anyone for years, who'd built walls around her heart to survive, placed her hand in his. Lucian drew her close, and for the first time she allowed herself to lean on someone. He said softly, just for her, that she'd never have to run again, that the nightmare was over, that she was home. Behind them, Derek lay groaning on the ground, handcuffed and dragged away by Lucian's men. He screamed threats, promised revenge, swore he'd find Raven, even if he had to crawl through hell itself. No one looked at him. No one listened. He'd lost all power the moment he chose to threaten the Ashford family, and now he was nothing more than a defeated man waiting for justice. Derek Lawson didn't die from Lucian's bullet, but he would probably wish he had once he faced what awaited him. He was arrested along with 23 accomplices involved in the attack on the estate, all handed over to the FBI together with the mountain of evidence Raven had provided in the weeks before. Secret warehouses were raided, bank accounts frozen, and corrupt officials and police officers dragged into the light. The human trafficking network Derek had built over more than a decade collapsed like a line of dominoes. And when the final sentence was handed down, he received a total of 70 years without parole. He would die in prison, old and alone, and that was the sweetest justice Raven could imagine. Barrett didn't escape either. He was found in a small town across the Mexican border, living off his savings and the constant fear that both Derek and the Ashfords were hunting him. He was extradited back to the U.S. to face a long list of charges, from corruption to conspiracy with organized crime, and his career as a park ranger ended in disgrace with a 15-year prison sentence. Old Walter was not forgotten either. Lucian used his legal influence to have all charges against the gentle veteran dropped, and he was invited to live in a quiet cottage on the Ashford estate. Raven often visited him, and for the first time in his life, Walter finally found a home where the ghosts of his past could no longer reach him. The warrant for Raven Cole was completely withdrawn after the FBI confirmed it had been fabricated through Derek's bribery of officials. She was cleared as a key witness in the case, and Raven Cole officially ceased to be a fugitive. But to her, Raven Cole had died long ago. The woman who stepped out of the shadowed past was Raven Blackwood, a new person with a new life and possibilities she'd never dared to imagine. A month after that night of hell, life at the Ashford estate slowly returned to normal, or a new version of normal Raven was learning to live with. She no longer looked over her shoulder every second, no longer mapped escape routes every time she entered a room, no longer jolted awake at every unfamiliar sound in the night. Nightmares still came sometimes, but they'd lost their power, fading into pale ghosts of memory instead of monsters that could drag her under. Isla clung to her even more after that night, as if afraid Raven might vanish if she looked away for even a moment. The girl followed her everywhere around the estate, held her hand during forest walks, sat beside her when she read, and every night before bed ran to Raven's small house to hug her and say goodnight. Raven wasn't used to such open affection, but she was learning to accept it little by little, like someone parched learning to drink in careful sips so the body doesn't go into shock. One full moon night, as Raven sat on the porch of her small house watching the forest draped in silver light like something enchanted, familiar footsteps sounded on the gravel path. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. She'd learned Lucian's stride long ago, steady and sure, just like the man himself. Lucian sat down beside her on the porch step and stayed silent for a long time. They were used to silence between them, the easy quiet of two people who understood each other well enough not to fill every space with words, but tonight felt different. A gentle but unmistakable tension in the air, like an invisible thread pulling them closer. At last, Lucian spoke, his voice low and deliberate as if weighing every word. He said he didn't know how to do this, whatever was happening between them, something he'd tried to ignore but couldn't anymore. He said he'd closed his heart the day Helena died, sworn never to let anyone in again because he was terrified of losing them too. But Raven had broken down every wall he'd built, not by force, but simply by being there, resilient and brave and broken in a way he understood. Raven turned to look at him, moonlight tracing the sharp lines of her face and the depth of her gray eyes. She said she didn't know how to do this either. She'd never been loved the right way, never believed she deserved to be. She'd built her own walls, not of ice like his, but of thorns and darkness, pushing people away before they had the chance to hurt her. Somehow, he and Isla had found their way in, and now she was afraid that if she lost them, she wouldn't survive it. Lucian lifted his hand and cupped her cheek, gentle as if she were something precious and fragile. He said they didn't need to know how. They'd learn together, stumble together, rebuild together from the ruins of the past. He didn't promise he'd never hurt her, because he wasn't perfect and life wasn't a fairy tale. But he promised he'd be here, every day, fighting beside her instead of against her. Then he leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a fiery, consuming kiss like in movies or novels. It was slow and tender, the kiss of two broken souls finding a way to mend each other, a kiss of promise and hope and new beginnings. His lips were warm against hers, and Raven felt tears slide down her cheeks without bothering to wipe them away. Under that moonlit sky, in the arms of the man she'd learned to trust, Raven understood that she was truly home. 1 year after that moonlit night, Raven stood on a podium at an opening ceremony she'd never imagined she would one day lead. Behind her rose a 3-story building painted a clean, luminous white, with the name Blackwood Haven standing out on a finely carved oak sign. This was a support center for survivors of human trafficking, a place she and Lucian had spent the past year building, a place where women like her, women who'd walked through hell and were still searching for the way out, could find safety, healing, and most of all, hope. She looked out at the crowd and saw Lucian standing in the front row with Isla beside him, both smiling at her with undisguised pride. The most feared Mafia boss on the East Coast was watching his woman shine, and in that moment, he wasn't Lucian Ashford, the powerful and dangerous man. He was simply a man in love and deeply loved in return. Margaret stood next to them, her silver hair catching the sunlight, her eyes shimmering with emotion. Chloe and Ghost stood just behind, and around them were the people who'd become Raven's family over the past year. They hadn't married in the traditional sense. Lucian hadn't knelt with a diamond ring, and Raven hadn't walked down an aisle in a white gown. But in every way that mattered, they were a family. They lived together in the main house, shared breakfast every morning, and every night before bed, Isla ran to hug them both and called Raven Mom. The first time the girl used that word, Raven had cried for an hour, and Lucian had held her in silence until the tears finally stopped. A week after the opening, Raven took Isla and Lucian into the Blackwood Forest, to the place she'd once called home during 2 years of running. The hollow beneath the fallen oak was still there, now covered in green moss and decaying leaves, as if the forest itself was trying to erase the scars of those painful days. Isla looked around with wide eyes and asked if her mother had really lived here, asked if it had been lonely, asked how she'd managed to survive. Raven looked at Lucian, then at Isla, then at the forest that had once been her only refuge. She said yes. It had been unbearably lonely, so lonely that some nights she wondered whether she was still human or had become something else entirely. But this place had taught her the most important lesson she'd ever learned. Lucian asked what that was. Raven smiled and took his hand in Isla's, drawing them close. She said the forest had taught her that sometimes, to find home, you first have to lose your way. You have to lose everything to understand what truly matters. You have to hit the deepest bottom to learn how to rise again. And you have to learn how to live alone before you can learn how to live with someone else. They walked out of the forest together, hand in hand, Isla running ahead chasing a yellow butterfly. Behind them, the ghosts of the past finally dissolved into the sunlight, and Raven knew she'd never have to return to this place as someone running for her life again. Raven's story reminds us that no matter how dense the darkness, dawn will always come, that every scar tells a story of survival, and surviving is already a victory. That family isn't always bound by blood, but by those who choose to stand beside us when the world turns its back, and that sometimes redemption comes from the places we least expect, from a strange child bitten by a snake, from a cold man with a broken heart, from the very pain we once believed would destroy us. If this story has touched your heart, please like and share this video with the people you love. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss more moving stories each day. How do you feel about Raven's journey? And is there something in her story that reflects your own life? We'd truly love to read the words that come from the deepest part of your heart in the comments. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. We wish you and your loved ones strength, peace, and joy in your lives every day. Goodbye, and we hope to see you again in the next video.